The garage was unusually quiet that morning, the kind of silence that makes old machines feel alive, as if they are waiting to be awakened. And right in the center of it stood the red Datsun 240Z, a true classic from another era, its curves glowing under the soft overhead lights like a piece of automotive history frozen in time. But today was not about preserving the past. It was about challenging it, because as the hood slowly lifted, revealing decades of grease, metal fatigue, and mechanical simplicity, the plan became clear and almost unbelievable. This vintage icon was about to receive a heart from the future, a 2025 engine that was never meant to exist in a car like this. And as I stepped back, staring at the engine bay, the weight of what we were about to do finally hit me, triggering that raw, instinctive reaction. This could either become the most insane upgrade ever attempted on a classic car, or a complete disaster. And there was no middle ground. The original engine sat there like an old warrior, scarred but proud, having survived decades of roads, weather, and careless drivers. And as the hoist chains tightened and the engine began to lift, every creak and metallic sound echoed through the garage, reminding me that we were physically removing history, inch by inch, while the Datsun's empty engine bay looked almost vulnerable, exposed like it knew something unfamiliar was coming. Across the garage, resting on a clean platform, waited the 2025 engine, sleek, compact, glowing with blue accents, wires neatly integrated, sensors and technology packed so tightly it looked more like a spacecraft component than something meant to power a car, and the contrast between the two engines was shocking, almost offensive, like placing a smartphone next to a rotary phone. And in that moment, I couldn't help but laugh and shout, asking myself what kind of madness convinces someone to merge a 1970s soul with 2025 intelligence. This wasn't just an engine swap anymore. It was a collision of eras, philosophies, and engineering mindsets, where raw mechanical feel would meet digital precision. And as I walked around the car, touching the fender, feeling the cold metal, I promised myself one thing. This build would respect the legacy of the Datsun while fearlessly embracing the future, because if we were going to do this, we would do it properly, documenting every challenge, every failure, and every victory, starting right now, with an empty engine bay, a glowing future engine waiting its turn, and a classic car that had no idea it was about to be reborn. With the old engine finally out and the Datsun 240Z sitting silently with an empty engine bay, reality began to sink in, because removing history was the easy part and fitting the future was where the real battle would begin. And as we rolled the 2025 engine closer to the car, its compact yet aggressive design instantly raised questions that no spec sheet could answer, because on paper it looked perfect, lighter, more powerful, smarter, but standing next to a chassis designed in the 1970s, the differences felt almost insulting, as if the car itself was questioning our sanity. The first test fit didn't even take 5 minutes to expose the problem. Because the engine mounts didn't line up, the clearance near the firewall was tighter than expected, and the steering rack sat exactly where modern engineers never imagined it would be, forcing us to step back and reassess everything we thought we knew. And that's when the excitement turned into frustration, because this wasn't a bolt-on fantasy build. This was real engineering, real compromises, and real decisions that would define whether this project would succeed or fail. The garage filled with measuring tapes, laser levels, sketches on cardboard, and arguments about millimeters that felt like kilometers, because moving the engine slightly forward affected weight balance, shifting it backward risked firewall modifications, and lowering it changed suspension geometry, proving that every decision carried consequences. And as the man behind the build wiped sweat from his face, staring at the car with arms crossed, it became clear that respecting the Datsun's soul meant not forcing the future into it blindly, but adapting both worlds carefully. Wiring became the next nightmare even before the engine was mounted, because the 2025 engine relied on sensors, control units, and digital communication that the Datsun had never known, turning the car into a mechanical body that suddenly needed a digital nervous system. And the idea of blending analog gauges with modern ECUs sparked another debate. Do we hide the tech to preserve the vintage look, or embrace it and let the future show itself? Moments like these tested patience because nothing was visually impressive yet. Nothing looked YouTube-ready. And yet this stage was the most important, the unseen foundation that would decide everything later. And as the engine hovered once again on the hoist, inches from the engine bay, we realized that this build wasn't about speed or power alone. It was about proving that two eras could coexist if handled with respect, precision, and a little madness. And even though frustration lingered in the air, it was mixed with determination. Because every problem uncovered here was one less disaster waiting down the road. And as the lights dimmed in the garage and tools were put away for the night, the Datsun sat there unfinished, incomplete, but full of potential, silently waiting for the moment when the future would finally settle into its past. The third phase of the build marked the moment where frustration slowly transformed into focus, because after days of failed test fits and endless measurements, the realization finally settled in that nothing about this swap would work unless we created our own solutions. And that's where true craftsmanship began, as custom engine mounts became the first real commitment to this build, cutting, welding, and reshaping metal not just to make the 2025 engine fit, but to make it belong. And as sparks flew in the garage, lighting up the walls like brief flashes of hope, it felt like the Datsun itself was being rewritten piece by piece, adapting without losing its identity. Once the mounts were mocked up, the engine was lowered again, this time more carefully, slower than before, every inch monitored, every clearance checked twice. And for the first time since this project began, the engine settled into the bay without resistance, sitting low, centered, and balanced, creating a silence in the garage that was broken only by a shared look of disbelief. Because that single moment confirmed that the impossible was now physically real, but fitting the engine was only half the victory, because wiring turned the garage into a battlefield of logic and patience, as modern ECUs, sensors, and communication lines demanded order while the Datsun's original system offered none, forcing us to build a bridge between decades, mapping signals, rerouting power, and deciding which parts of the past would stay and which would be quietly retired. And as wires were labeled and loomed, it became clear that this wasn't just mechanical work anymore. It was teaching a classic car how to think. The dashboard sparked another turning point because instead of replacing everything, the decision was made to preserve the analog gauges while letting modern data work invisibly behind the scenes, a compromise that respected the soul of the car while allowing the future to function properly. And that choice alone gave the build its identity. Not a restamod chasing trends, but a thoughtful fusion of eras. Hours passed unnoticed, hands covered in grease, minds locked into problem-solving mode, until the engine was finally bolted down permanently, hoses connected, wiring secured, and the hoist unhooked, leaving the 2025 engine sitting on its own for the first time inside the Datsun. No longer a visitor, but a resident. Stepping back, the transformation was undeniable because even without turning the key, the car felt different, heavier with purpose, sharper with intent, and, as the garage lights reflected off the engine's modern surfaces, the sense of achievement was overwhelming, knowing that this build had crossed the line from idea to reality, from concept to commitment, and while there was still a long road ahead before the engine would breathe life into the chassis, this was the point of no return. The moment where the Datsun 240Z officially became something new, something bold, something that carried its past proudly while standing firmly in the future. With the engine now resting perfectly in the bay, the focus shifted to the finer details that would separate a functional swap from a true masterpiece. Every bolt, bracket, and hose became a test of patience because fitting was no longer just about clearance. It was about intention. The radiator went in next, custom fitted with new mounts that mirrored the precision of the engine brackets. And as coolant lines snaked through the chassis, it was clear that this car was slowly learning a new language, one of modern engineering translated into the vocabulary of a 1970s machine. Brackets were trimmed, hoses bent just enough to avoid contact, and clamps tightened until they whispered satisfaction rather than groaned under tension. Next came the intake and exhaust systems, a symphony of airflow that had to balance performance with packaging. The exhaust manifold, modern and tight, needed every centimeter negotiated, every curve tested against the frame and steering linkage. Sparks of frustration appeared when the first mock-ups refused to cooperate, but persistence, sketches, and a touch of improvisation turned each rejection into a minor victory. By the time headers slid into place, everything fit as if the chassis had been waiting for this engine all along. And yet, the Datsun silhouette remained untouched, its identity preserved despite the intrusion of modernity. Electronics demanded their own choreography. The ECU, now fully mounted, sat like a brain waiting to synchronize the heartbeat of the car. Sensors were plugged in, relays secured, and the wiring harness carefully routed through the firewall. For hours, each connection was checked and rechecked, continuity tested with a multimeter, signals mapped to ensure that the 240Z could communicate seamlessly with its new heart. Every wire that found its proper place felt like a sentence written in the car's evolving story, a sentence that bridged decades without erasing history. Fuel lines were routed next, braided stainless steel weaving through the engine bay with a tension that suggested both safety and aggression. The pump roared to life when primed, and fuel pressure danced on the gauge like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Oil lines followed, carefully braided and bended, each fitting tested and tightened, until the entire system felt like a living circulatory system, ready to sustain the engine's life once ignition was pressed. As the final touches came into place, engine covers polished, hoses secured, clamps torqued, the Datsun transformed in ways more than mechanical. Standing back, it no longer felt like a classic car with a modern engine jammed inside. It felt like a conversation between eras, a dialogue written in steel, wires, and oil. There was tension and triumph, patience and creativity, and an undeniable sense that the project had moved from pure construction into artistry. Every decision, every weld, every wire had contributed to a singular truth. The car was no longer just a 240Z, nor was it merely a 2025 engine. It was something entirely new, a careful marriage of past and present, waiting silently for the spark that would bring it to life. With every mechanical and electrical piece finally in place, the garage shifted from a workshop to a theater of anticipation. The moment had arrived to see whether months of planning, fabricating, and problem-solving could coalesce into motion. The Datsun 240Z, once a silent observer of its own transformation, now sat like a patient predator, engine bay polished, wires tucked, hoses secure, every bolt torqued, every surface clean of fingerprints and sweat. The team gathered around, gloves still on, hearts racing, because in this moment, theory would meet reality. Turning the key, or rather, pressing the starter button wired into the retrofitted system, was an act of ritual. The first electrical hum surged through the ECU, sensors flickered, fuel pump buzzed, and oil pressure leapt to life. Lights danced across the dashboard, analog gauges vibrating slightly in acknowledgement, and the engine coughed, then coughed again, testing its new home as if reminding everyone that it was no stranger to challenge. Hands hovered over controls, ready to intervene, while ears strained for every note, every hesitation, every heartbeat of this mechanical creature. Then, like a slow crescendo, the 2025 engine settled into its rhythm. The garage filled with the sound of precise combustion, a mechanical symphony bridging decades. The car vibrated under its own power, but in a controlled, purposeful way. Exhaust notes rolled deep and confident, flowing through the carefully fitted headers, reverberating off the walls, and the scent of oil and fresh coolant mixed with the tang of heated metal, a sensory signature of success. For a moment, everyone froze, letting the engine speak for itself, the realization sinking in. The impossible had been achieved. But the victory wasn't just in the sound. It was in the movement, the harmonization of systems old and new. The gauges tracked faithfully, digital signals translated seamlessly into analog dials, The fuel and oil systems maintained perfect pressure, and the engine's weight felt balanced as it rested on the mounts that had once seemed impossible. Every decision made months ago, the compromises, the welds, the careful routing of hoses and wires, revealed its wisdom in real time. The car was no longer a collection of parts. It was alive, conscious of its own architecture, and utterly confident in its new identity. Stepping back, the team allowed themselves a brief moment of triumph. Tools were set aside, sweat wiped away, and smiles exchanged. The Datsun, once a project on paper, a dream in sketches and measurements, now existed fully in the physical world, ready to carry its driver into a new chapter of speed, precision, and artistry. And while countless miles lay ahead before mastery would be proven on the road, the first ignition had permanently altered the relationship between the car and its creators. It was no longer an idea, no longer a test. It was reality, alive with promise, a perfect blend of past heritage and future innovation.